I've got a whole bunch of books this year, more than usual, which is good. So we're going to kick right in. I try to be objective about the list, like I said, because anyone's personal favorites are not anyone else's personal favorites. But every now and again, a few favorites do sneak onto the list because it is my prerogative. But this one always merits a place on the list. This is Mrs. Osmond by John Banville. And for those of you who've read Henry James's Portrait of the Lady, the name Mrs. Osmond may ring a bell. In a true departure for Banville, who's won the Man Booker Prize among many other prizes, he has written a sequel to another author's book. The Portrait of a Lady has a rather famously ambiguous ending, and James himself considered going back and writing a sequel to it, but just never got around to it. So Banville, a few years ago, decided to take up that mantle. And he's done it brilliantly because it reads and feels like James, but it has Banville's fingerprints all over it. And it's always tricky to breathe new life into a classic character, especially when the authors are from such different times. But Banville's worked in a variety of historical periods over the years, and he's clearly familiar with James's style. So he takes Mrs. Osmond, or Isabel Archer as she originally was, and moves her in these kind of new and unexpected ways that James wouldn't have. But since I appreciate James, but I really love Banville, I was particularly taken with how this new novel is, for me, a much more engaging read in a way, because it is Jamesian, but he takes kind of his new style and just moves the character in different ways that James didn't. The only real caveat to recommending this book, however, is that it would really help if you already knew or had read The Portrait of a Lady. So, as much of a literature geek as I am, people don't usually recommend you read Henry James for fun, but I'm kind of doing that. It is a classic, it's a great book, and I wouldn't be doing my appropriate job as a collection development librarian if I didn't suggest you threw in a classic once in a while. I actually, whenever Banville comes out with a new book, I go see him in Harvard Square. And he was just here a couple months ago, and he said this really funny thing where he referred to Henry James's book as a prequel to his own novel, and which makes him sound a little cocky unless you realize how good Banville really is and how much subtle humor is in all of his books. It's a tremendous piece of work. The language is beautiful. Nobody writes like Banville, in my opinion. So even though this does come with a little bit of Jamesian homework, it is definitely worth it. And I apologize in advance if I cough, because I have these mics on me, and I can walk away from a standing mic. I can't walk away from these, so it might be loud, and I apologize for that. The next one is a marvelous circumstance where a personal favorite of mine is also widely acclaimed. And how often am I going to get to put a piece of literary criticism on my list? Barely ever. This is The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World by Maya Jasanoff. And Maya is a Harvard professor, and I've seen her referred to in 2 different publications as, quote, our most exciting new historian. And they actually put it on the book jacket, and that's not a phrase you hear a lot, exciting in historian, even though there's many. This is not a straight piece of criticism on another, dead white European writer, but it is a fantastic reinterpretation of Conrad as someone she calls a prophet of globalization. Conrad and I go way back. He's one of my favorite authors from when I was a kid. And one of the things that makes him so interesting, and this is mentioned often in the book, is that from the same period that Conrad came from, he was not a writer who wrote kind of society pieces and pieces necessarily about relationships and families and that kind of thing. He explored the world, lived a life, learned all he needed to learn, and then wrote about those experiences. He was born in Poland, immigrated to England, and then he worked and traveled by sea for 20 years, and he went to places like the Congo and the Malay Peninsula and the Caribbean before finally settling down in England, where he decided to write in his 3rd language, which he didn't even learn until he was in his 20s. So that alone makes him one of my favorites. He's just a brilliant, brilliant guy. In the early pages of the book, I wrote this down because I wanted to remember it, Jasanoff says, quote, "I set out to explore Conrad's world with the compass of an historian, the chart of a biographer, and the navigational sextant of a fiction reader." That line alone, I adore this woman right from the get-go. And I've read a lot of books about authors and not just their novels, but just how they interpret the world. And this is probably my favorite, and not just because I like Conrad. As far as relevance goes, I mean, Conrad lived in a time where cultures were grappling dealing with an increased global world and the tensions and opportunities that afforded. And it's just one of the most well-written and deeply engaging books I've ever read about an author. And I've recommended this to two people who have completely divergent reading styles, and they both absolutely adored it. And I was stunned at one of them. It was kind of, well, I'm reading this, and oh, I'll read that. And they loved it. You don't have to know anything about Conrad to appreciate this book, because Jasanoff really tells you everything you really need to know. And I think if you have any interest in literature or travel literature, you will enjoy it. It's a great book and a brilliant piece of critical thinking. This next one, keeping mildly with literature for a moment, historical literature anyway. Wonderful, excellent. I get a thumbs up from Valerie. Good. This is one of those books I feel like I just have to describe to you, and you realize how good it is. This is an Odyssey, a father, a son, and an epic by Daniel Mendelsohn. Mendelssohn's kind of a writer's writer. I mean, he's won the awards. He's regularly appears in the New Yorker and New York Review of Books, and he teaches the classics at Bard. So he's certainly got the pedigree. A few years ago, he was preparing to teach the Odyssey to his students when his 81-year-old father asked if he could sit in on the class. And his father, J. Mendelsohn, who is a retired scientist and mathematician, is not a literary guy, but a very smart, stubborn man who certainly lived a life. That's a new sound. That's the whole building, just so you know.
It's a heater, isn't it?
No, it's not actually. It's coming from the whole building. Okay. If we all die now, it's lovely to know you all. Thank you very much. I've worked here long enough to know where all the cracks and the seams are, so we'll be fine, I think, but that'll stop. So his father sits on his class, and he takes part in the conversation, has lively debates and disagreements with his son's interpretations of part of the class. But then when the class is over, the two men travel to the Mediterranean for one of those kind of themed cruises that travels around in the path of the original Odyssey. And if you're familiar with the Odyssey, as epic as it is, it's really just about a man trying to get home. And all the troubles he goes through contrasted with the troubles his wife is going through, fending off 9 million suitors in his absence. And the way in the end these two people, Odysseus and Penelope, it was a truck.
It was a car. It was a Porsche.
It was a Porsche?
Yeah.
Of course it was a Porsche.
Showing his engine to somebody else.
Thank you. So the story I mean, if you boil it right down, it's the way these two people, there you go, reunite in oh, I know him. Okay. I'll talk to him on Tuesdays when he comes back. I know the plate now. So it's the way these two people wind up reuniting in the end. His journey takes 10 years, and in the end, Odysseus and Penelope must rediscover each other again, the same way that Daniel and Jay rediscover each other through the process of this class and this tour. I don't know if I've ever read a more personal or accessible piece of literary commentary, because he does talk about the Odyssey a lot, but he doesn't do it in this straight up level of criticism. He does it by intertwining the details of this epic of all epics with the most ordinary minutiae of his life and his father's life and his class and the students in his class life. It's just a wonderful way to do it. And as someone who loves the Odyssey and a well-written memoir, as I think we all do, it's just a treat. It was just undeniably well-written, held my attention the whole way through, and there's just so much learning about life and literature through this journey to the Mediterranean, and what they did in the time after that between the two men. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous book. Okay, I'm going to tell you right now, and I have multiple books today that deal with kind of difficult topics because for some reason it seemed to be the year for it. There are trends every year, and there's just whatever the topic is. Every year there's just little ebbs and flows. So this is a little gem of a novel, moving into fiction for a bit, called Goodbye Vitamin by Rachel Kahn. It's her first novel. She's had a fair amount of fiction and nonfiction published in the last decade or so, but this is her first full book. And the story revolves around a 30-year-old woman named Ruth, whose life is in a bit of turmoil, and her best option is to kind of leave it all behind and return home and help her mother care for her father, who is battling Alzheimer's. Her mother's been the main caregiver for a while, so she's understandably a little bit burnt out, and Ruth finds herself kind of inventing new and creative ways to help her with her father. Now, that idea of a plot is certainly not groundbreaking, and I dare say in the last 5 or 6 years there's been multiple books about this, a couple of great ones in the last few years, actually. But the thing is, the plot may sound familiar, but the voice is something that I hadn't heard before. There's a lot of humor here, and it's certainly not meant to be laugh out loud funny. It's meant to be relatable and human. It's meant to show that sometimes the only way to handle a rough situation is to come at it with a lighter touch, because sometimes when you meet tragedy with tragedy, it just becomes a black hole. The book is written in these diary entries with dated sections of varying lengths that cover the year that she's been living with her parents. And I think it's the way she uses the chapters that makes me happiest about the book, and I do get happy about books. I think you know that. I can get giddy, like a little boy with a Lego set, when I read a well-turned phrase or a good book. And some of the sections here are just beautiful, especially the ones that really read like diary entries, because there are some that are larger narrative blocks, as they need to be to move the story forward, but there are some that are just these little 2-sentence thoughts or moments that really encapsulate so much. And just define Ruth's experience, and it's just so memorable, and I think it's really something special. Again, it is the first of several books on unfortunately difficult diseases today, but that's just the way it rolled this year. But it's a really lovely book. I thoroughly enjoyed that one. And again, we're going to stay with the topic of Alzheimer's for a minute, because I always find one or two really fascinating medical themed books every year, not intentionally. It just, there's always, I think if I took all my years together and, okay, here's the medical book, here's the thriller, I don't intend to do that. Maybe I do in the back of my head, but it's just the way it works out. But of all the medical themed books this year, the clear winner was The Inheritance by Nikki Kapsambellis. I will say up front, I was very good friends with Nikki in high school, and so it was one of the true joys of my professional life to be able to add her book to the collection. I haven't seen her in 20 years, but and then when I read it and loved it, and then read that every other reviewer on the planet loved it just as well, I knew it was a shoo-in for this talk today. The subtitle of the book is A Family on the Front Lines of the Battle Against Alzheimer's Disease. And what makes it so affecting is that it is about a family. Nikki spent her career as a journalist, working for Associated Press, Washington Post, among other publications. And she clearly knows the way to make a story relatable is to do it from a personal point of view. But she does it one better because she interweaves the story of the DeMoe family from North Dakota with the story of the doctors who are constantly researching not just their case, but Alzheimer's in general, as it is still the only major disease with no functioning treatment or cure. The story of the family is that when two of the DeMoe siblings were diagnosed with early Alzheimer's several years ago, the family became aware that the other 4 siblings were also at risk, and then looking back, this extensive family pattern emerged. And so what's really impressive about the story is that this family has allowed themselves to be extensively interviewed and studied, not just by Nikki, but by these researchers who are trying and have been able to learn so much about the disease by the way it affects this one family. And it's clearly an emotional story, but a really powerful one, especially because of the intimacy with which the family shares their stories and the clear and kind of uncluttered way that Nikki tells it. And with all these books today that come up with different issues, obviously they're very relatable for anyone who's experienced things like this, but one of the reasons that I choose to add them is that it's not just, you don't have to just have experienced these things yourself. They're so relatable and they help you learn so much about just the human condition and people you may know, people you may never know. And overall, it's just an exceptional piece of writing. I've realized that I've run out of adjectives for, I'm going to say it's a wonderful book, it's a great book, it's well written. I know there's several hundred adjectives that I could use better. They never come. I just keep wanting to say, it's just so good. It's great, you should read it, it's wonderful, I loved it. And I know that I should be a little more specifically declarative, but that's not what you're going to get. I'm going to go back to some fiction again. Actually, no, I forgot this one. Cool. This one is interesting compared to the last one because this is a topic that I dare say most of us have never considered or even been aware of. This is Nomadland, Surviving America in the 21st Century by Jessica Bruder. And Bruder is a journalist who traveled all over the country for 3 years and 15,000 miles, as she says, hearing the stories of older Americans who are part of a new kind of mobile RV workforce. And the book finds its focus through the story of one particular woman named Linda May. She talks to many people, but Linda is kind of the focus. And there are over tens of thousands of Americans who are old enough to be on Social Security but can't find a way to make ends meet, so they have chosen to live out of campers and mobile homes, moving from job to job, like this itinerant workforce right out of the 30s. The jobs that people take run the gamut, and remember the age of these people. They run the gamut from seasonal farming, running campgrounds, and this surprisingly very large and very serious program run through Amazon.com called Camper Force. It's an actual camper force. Where the online giant realized several years ago that the best way to fill high demands for seasonal help was to tap into this growing population of workers. And I think that story in itself merits a whole book, whether Amazon is reacting to this itinerant force or taking advantage of the itinerant force. That's worth a whole book, and I'm sure there's a good article out there somewhere. But what's really fascinating about the book is the way that most of the people Bruder talks to have taken this decision that made from hardship and turned it into this kind of adventure of a kind. And certainly not all of them, but a large number of them. And there's a lot more hope here than I kind of thought there would be when I just thought of the idea of it, of people kind of forced to do this major shift. These are... The best part about the book, I think, as far as its relatability, is that these are not people who worked manual labor jobs all their lives and then realized they didn't save anything. These are people that had retirement plans and investments and nice homes and plans to travel the world when they retired. But a lot of them lost a lot of their money or home values in the '08 recession and wound up just hearing about, well, I could do that, the RV thing, and then they did it out of necessity. It's a sobering story. I mean, every person in this book, there's certainly hints of desperation and why they're there, but there's a surprising amount of kind of hope and optimism about it. And I think relevance-wise, in a country where the lifespan's getting longer, but savings account to maintain that is getting harder to build and therefore harder to maintain, it's not just a snapshot of today, but possibly a template for tomorrow. So. It's a really interesting book, and it definitely caught me by surprise, which I love. That's the problem with reading hundreds and hundreds of books a year. It's hard to get surprised by anything anymore, so I like surprises. Nice big novel. This is a wonderful book, beautifully heartbreaking just from the description of the plot alone, to be honest. This is Lucky Boy by Shanti Sekharan. And while it is certainly about a boy, named Ignacio. It's really about two women and their lives in relationship to Ignacio. The core of the story is that a young woman named Solimar, or Solly, is an undocumented immigrant who has just arrived in Berkeley, California from Mexico, and she's planning to stay and work with her cousin. These are already difficult and challenging plans considering she's undocumented, but they become even more complicated when she realizes that she's pregnant. The other woman in the story is named Kavya. She's an Indian-American woman who has a pretty nice life, but is consumed with the desire to have a child, and she just can't conceive herself. So I'm pretty sure you know where this is going, but there's nothing predictable about the story at all, really, which is what's so awesome about it. Solly gets detained. Kavya has recently entered into the foster care program. And of course, Kavya winds up caring for Ignacio. So you have one woman whose entire life is in turmoil, desperate to regain her baby, and another who's wanted a child for so long. And there's this brilliant quote, when did I put it? This brilliant quote on the book jacket that says, for Kavya, she builds her love on a fault line, her heart wrapped around someone else's child. It's beautiful. And that's just in the blurb. The author didn't even write that, so it gets better than that. There's clearly a lot of emotional content here, and I was really pulled into the story, mainly because one of the best parts about the construction of the story, and again, if you've talked to me before, I don't give things away about books. I hate it because I had a book ruined for me once, and I'll never forget it. Still, I remember who did it, too. I won't tell you, but I can tell you everything about them. And one of the best parts about it is that the baby isn't even born until halfway through the book. And I really felt as I was reading it that a lesser author would have started with that and then played the women off of each other in some way the rest of the book. But because she didn't do that, she really lets you live with these women for a while and understand who they are and their circumstances and how badly they want this thing. And so then when you get to that point, I just got chills actually just thinking about it. That's so funny. See, I love this stuff. You feel the real impact of the story because there are no heroes or villains here. It's just these two good, fully drawn people, both desperate for literally the exact same thing, but coming at it from very different directions. It touches on so many subjects that are relevant to our cultural and political climate, and it's really emotionally charged, beautifully written book. And again, I love beautifully, wonderfully written books, and this is one of them. Okay. Ooh, I have a good one next. I do love this job. Every year I've got a little bit of an outlier. It's kind of a book so good that I have to talk about it, even though it may seem a little weird. I had a great one last year called Pond by Claire Louise Bennett, which I adored. And this year it's this book called Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin. I knew I was going to mess up that name. Tiny. It's this little book. For those of you who've talked about books before, you may know I have this predilection for little books, like short little. Lily Tuck writes these wonderful, little, beautiful, otherworldly little books, and I have a deep affection for them. And this is a perfect fit for that. Schweblin is from Buenos Aires, currently lives in Berlin, and she's published a few collections of short stories over the years to great acclaim, but this is her first novel. And usually for this talk, there's a chance I'm going to tell you nothing about this book. Fever Dream is a very appropriate title, as that's exactly what the story is and feels like, which is the trick. It's surreal, unique, completely its own thing. The only facts that I can really tell you, that I will tell you, I can tell you much. I will tell you little. It's basically about a woman named Amanda who is lying in a hospital bed, and she's talking with a young boy named David who is sitting with her. Amanda's trying to figure out not only why she's in the hospital, but something else far bigger than that, and David is kind of helping her talk through it. And the whole story is basically a dialogue between Amanda and David. And again, Fever Dream is the title, and relevant. Is this cutting out on me? The wild part about it is that it's kind of like sitting down to watch a suspense film that's already half over, and you have to try and kind of figure out what's going on and what this means. And like I said, it's an outlier, but it's mysterious and poetic and a little eerie at times, and it's so short and so mesmerizing that it almost demands to be read again, which is what I did. But it's just a trip, and if you take your time with it, it's just a beautiful example of imagery and storytelling. And there's something, if you've ever read work in translation, there's something about certain authors from South America. I'm not sure what it is. It's the Borges tradition. I'm not sure what it is. There's just this imagistic, surreal thing that is beautiful. And so this is a great entry to that because it's short. I'm not telling you to read, 500-page Spanish novel or something. This is great. Love it. And I'm actually going to stay in my little world of small books for a moment. For those of us like myself who loved Sam Shepard, 2017 was a rough year as he died last July from complications with ALS. And having written over 40 plays, a handful of short story collections, and I don't know how many film roles, he published his actually first novel last February, followed by one other piece of short fiction in December that was published posthumously. And actually, I'll put them both out. I'm going to talk about both of them actually today. First because they're so short, but also because they're just exceptional pieces of art. And Shepard used kind of all of his skills in the way he blends his own life and struggles into the fictional weave of the stories. The novel that appeared this time last year is called The One Inside, and it's very much in the vein of his plays. And there's this fantastic line on the book jacket that says it all. It says, where are we? It says, the rhythms of nature, the rhythms of theater, the language of poetry, and a flinty humor combine in this stunning meditation on the nature of experience, at once celebratory, surreal, poignant, and unforgettable. I tried and I couldn't get it better than that, so I just quoted them. The story, such as it is, follows a man who's living somewhere in the Southwest as he moves between present-day difficulties with a woman who's in and out of his life and memories of his father and a complex set of circumstances from his youth. But I said the story such as it is because if you've ever read any Shepard of his plays or anything, you know that he sometimes comes at things in pieces. He's not a straight, here's my story kind of guy. Steve knows this very well. The book is filled with these sections that are only 1 to 3 pages long, and I think when the blurb described it as having the language of poetry, they're not referring just to his actual language, but the style with which he uses it. And again, being a playwright for so many years, all of his work always begs to be read out loud, which I did for many sections of this book. And I do that, a lot, whether I'm alone or in a room full of people, unfortunately, but it's just what happens. It's a fascinating piece of writing, made all the more intriguing because he was already quite ill when he was writing it. And his illness and impending death plays even more heavily into his final book, which is this beautiful, truly small little piece of fiction called Spy of the First Person. And the idea of this one, being more poetic especially, the narrator uses a very clean, careful language to describe the memories that he's dealing with, the actions of the family members who are surrounding him, and his observation of this man across on the porch across the street, which is clearly a projection of himself and a way for him to kind of describe the illness that he's going through and what it's doing to him. This was actually published in December, several months after he died, and his children worked very hard he was like in his final days, he was working on getting this right, and they made sure it came out the way he wanted to. And they're both absolutely brilliant, powerful books. You could read them as a set, actually, because they're so short, but they're such excellent examples of what writing can do. And I think mainly because of the way he doesn't just place moments end to end, but he kind of overlaps things like a collage. And I think that most people know who Sam Shepard was, mostly just as an actor, or they know he was a writer or a player, but very few people have actually read him. This is your chance. They're wonderful books. The Spy Inside just came out. It's beautiful. Because they're fiction, because a lot of great writers write fiction even though they are painfully present as the narrator. They say they fictionalize things because they want to be able to have some leeway, but it's so clearly it's so clearly Shepard's voice. So I love them. They're great. This is one of those weird kind of you have to read it to believe it stories. This is American Fire: Love, Arson, and Life in a Vanishing Land by Monica Hess. Hess writes for the Washington Post. It was excellent. Something about a good journalist making a great author. She actually has written one other book, which is a young adult, it's like an historical mystery called Girl in the Blue Coat from 2016, which was terrific as well. So she's clearly a good storyteller. This book covers a series of over 60 fires in Accomack County, Virginia in 2012 and 2013. And it follows Hess's attempts to figure out the whys and wherefores of this strange rash of fires and the people behind them. And it's all the details that really make this story amazing, because it's not a story of finding out who did it, because she came into the story once they'd already been apprehended. It was the question of why they did it. And all the fires were set in abandoned buildings, of which there are many in this economically struggling community. And the guilty parties, this fairly hapless couple of Charlie Smith and Tonya Bundick, had no material gains from their crimes. Arson usually doesn't have material gains unless it's some insurance scheme. It's usually committed just for nothing more than the destructive act itself. And in an area with all of these empty and disheveled houses and buildings, it was a crime for these two that could be committed over and over again, apparently creating kind of a quasi-sexual thrill for this highly dysfunctional couple, Charlie and Tonya. And in a release, the key, I think, was a release from the stresses of living in this this economically hard environment. But it's that environment and that community that really makes the story so interesting, because the fires clearly stem from these two specific people and the dynamics of their own lives and relationship. But who they are and what they do is so directly tied to living in this once prosperous but now really downtrodden area. And then you have the story of the firemen, who are both official firemen and volunteer firemen, and the way they deal with the strangeness of having to deal with almost weekly fires, sometimes multiple fires in one night. And the issues surrounding something as simple as how much risk do you take when you know there's no residents' lives at risk, while still not knowing whether the next fire will have residents' lives at risk. It's a very quick, page-turning narrative of a very unique, I hate qualifying unique. You can't qualify unique, and I just did it. I apologize. A unique set of circumstances. It's a great kind of, sociological true crime story. And again, something you have to read to be believed. The characters, Charlie and Tonya, are just crazy. Okay, a little more history. This is a fantastic, very accessible piece of historical biography of two legendary men of Great Britain. This is Churchill and Orwell, The Fight for Freedom by Thomas Ricks. Ricks came on the scene about 20 years ago, and he wrote a very well-known book called Making the Corps, where he followed a group of young men as they went through Paris Island. It was one of the first books to do that. He's written several books about American military history, but this is the first time he's gone across the pond, so to speak. And a page-turner of a biography is amazing to me. It's just under 300 pages of deeply researched but quickly written pages. And Ricks looks at these two men in their lives in the 30s and 40s as they both worked from kind of different angles towards a similar goal, being the defeat of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. It's really kind of a little minor masterpiece, because both of these now legendary figures are so essential to British and world history, And writing about them both just seems like a perfect pairing. Churchill's been written about by so many people in so many different angles, that this kind of a comparative study brings kind of a new life to it in a way, at least it did for me. With Orwell, 1984 is a book I've read just about every year for about 25 years. And I've honestly never read extensively about Orwell. So personally, I love the fact that I could learn so much about him in really such a brief book. And what I learned about both of them is very pivotal information. And the reason that I think, and that all the exceptional reviews it got throughout the world, why I think it resonates with anybody, is that what these two men did is they did through words. They excelled at communicating what they felt, and it's all about words here for me. So in this terribly difficult time they lived in, they accomplished great things, but through words. So when they were confronted with these challenging circumstances, they acted where many people would just talk or do nothing at all. Both men unfortunately had fairly unhappy endings, but the book really revels in their finest moments, and all the reasons that Orwell and Churchill are being discussed today in relation to current events here in America and in England are made very clear. So it's not just a historical biography, but it definitely ties into the relevance of their actions and philosophies. So it's a really enlightening read, especially about the aspects of Churchill, because again, he's been written about so many times. It's just a wonderful take on it. This is another kind of a history, but it's more of a social medical history. It's called No One Cares About Crazy People: The Chaos and Heartbreak of Mental Health in America by Ron Powers. Powers is an award-winning journalist, author, co-author of multiple books. He's actually the co-author of Flags of Our Fathers, which is a very famous book about the basic on the photo of a group of Marines raising a flag in Iwo Jima. And that book is largely credited to James Bradley, whose father was in the picture. But Powers was more than instrumental in making that book happen, but he just suffered the fate of so many of the written with authors that they get second billing, even though, little hint, most of the second billing authors did the lion's share of the work. So he's an excellent author. It is a social history of mental illness in America, written by a wonderful writer, but the crux of the issue, and the reason the book is so good, is because it's a very personal story. It is framed through the story of his two sons named Kevin and Dean, who both suffer from schizophrenia. And there's so much to learn from this book, and while I knew I wanted to include it on the list, I knew it wasn't an easy book to really talk about or sell, so to speak. Powers himself in the preface says, "I hope you do not enjoy this book. I hope you are wounded by it, wounded as I have been in writing it." It's this incredibly personal but very powerful, unforgettable experience. And there's been so many memoirs about mental health over the years, starting kind of this resurgence in the 90s with like Girl Interrupted and An Unquiet Mind, and The Quiet Room by Laurie Schiller, which is kind of an underlier, but a fantastic book. But those were all, and they typically, most of these memoirs are people writing about their own experiences. There's something so powerful about someone writing about their children. It's obviously very affecting, and his writing about the topic in general is just exceptional. But it is powerful, and like he said, I hope you do not enjoy this book. It's a powerful book. So if you're up for it, it's a fantastic read. And we go from that to The Jungles of Honduras, because I can't handle the stress anymore. This is a much less dire book. For those of you who've talked with me at length about books before, or anyone who's asked about the desert island disc-like tattoo that is the bookshelf I have on my arm here, I'm a big fan of a particular range of escapist kind of thrillers co-authored by Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child. And they've both written a fair number of novels on their own. Preston has also written a lot of nonfiction, and this is the latest. It is Lost City of the Monkey God. And it's the story of a 2015 expedition to Honduras, for which Preston was the writer kind of in residence. He has a long history of something of kind of an explorer and outdoorsman, so he's a perfect choice for this. He actually wrote a long piece for National Geographic. soon after the expedition ended. And you can find that online, and there's some fantastic pictures. There's pictures in this, but there's some wonderful ones with the geographic article that didn't make the book. So as a thriller writer by nature, this is certainly an enthralling story, but it's not necessarily like some Indiana Jones type adventure. But it certainly is a thriller. The idea of the actual lost city of the Monkey God, or the White City as it's also called, is just kind of a classic story of an undiscovered but long rumored civilization, ancient city, possibly contemporary of the Maya. And recent advances, I've been seeing this a lot recently, recent advances in technology have this amazing new way of mapping, like Under the Jungle. They do this radar thing and you see all these, some of the images have been absolutely stunning. And people have been looking for this white city for a long time, found this area in Honduras where they saw this potential city structure and diverse group of explorers and scientists set up to see what they could see. And they saw a lot. And Preston does his typically wonderful job of setting the scene, managing a large cast of characters. Though this time the characters and incidents are all too real. And while the story simply of what they found is fascinating, they also talk about the bigger picture, including the way the Honduran government felt about outsiders coming in and finding things on their property, the way the archaeological community felt about what they found. And then this other whole thing that I don't want to go into, but let's just say there are bugs and diseases down there you do not want to mess with. It's a great piece of adventure writing, ranking right up there with the best of Preston and Child's thrillers. And I just love books like this. It's like books about underwater exploration. There's so many civilizations that have come and gone that are just kind of waiting to be rediscovered, so to speak. So I really enjoyed taking this ride. And again, if you like it, the article on the National Geographic is fantastic as well. Okay. Another thriller, but a fictional thriller at this point. This is from a Michigan author, and it's called The Marsh King's Daughter by Karen Dion. I'm running out of space here. I never have this many books, so I'm running out of space. It's got a heck of a premise, and I'll tell you right from the opening pages, Dion has made a real effort to create some serious atmosphere. The story takes place in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a place that she knows very well, and every article out there mentioned how really perceptive and excellent her descriptions were of the marshland and even just the flora and fauna, really setting this very realistic atmosphere. And it's the story of Helena, and Helena lives with her husband and 2 daughters, has a pretty nice life going for herself. But what no one knows is that she's actually the child of a woman who'd been kidnapped years ago, and Helena's father is the rather brutal man who abducted her mother. Helena was raised by her parents in the marshland, knew nothing of the world outside of what her father allowed her to know. But she and her mother were rescued from him 15 years before the novel starts. The suspense of the novel comes from the fact that her father has just broken out of prison, killing a couple guards in the process, and he's believed to have returned to the marshland where he hid for so many years. And while Helena is rightfully scared for herself and her daughters, she also realizes that she's probably the only person with any chance of catching him, because she knows this world where he went to better than anyone, because he's the one who taught her. The story is told by Helena, and right from page 1, I think you'll like her voice. I loved it. And what's so great about how she's crafted the character is that while Helena's childhood was based around these very difficult circumstances, she takes everything she learned about nature and just who she is, and creates this very original, non-cliched ridden victim kind of character. It's a very strong person, and the story moves back and forth between her present and her childhood, so we have a really full picture of who she is and what she's experienced. And on the first couple of pages, there were just this little perfect things. Right on page 1 or 2, the author references women like Elizabeth Smart and J.C. Duggard, and she does it just briefly, and it didn't feel exploitive at all. It was just this really simple, amazing way to relate so much backstory, because even if we don't know a lot about those stories, you have a sense of it. So right away, you were just imbued with this sense of who this person was or what they dealt with. And it was just a great way to open. It's a really solid thriller, pulls you in with a great follow-through, which doesn't always happen with thrillers, as we all know. You get excited. Oh, there was okay. Next book, yeah, it's great follow-through, loved it. And this is a little gem called The Grip of It. I'm running out of space. I'm just going to see if that works. And it's by a woman named Jack Gems. And it's pretty much a modern version of a classic haunted house story. But the real calling card of the book is the writing. I do not know how many times I stopped, shook my head, and reread certain passages of this thing. It's ridiculous. I probably read it twice in reading it once. I just kept looking at things. And I read a really wide variety of books, and I've certainly read more than my share of suspenseful books or thrillers over the years. But this thing had moments where I just really got the creeps, and I mean that in the best way, because it's just stunning. The story follows Julie and James, who are a young couple that have moved to a small town after leaving the city, basically because James has this gambling problem. It's not really a big part, but they leave the city because of this. They want to get him away from temptations. And they buy this little house that has this kind of weird but cool vibe. But also from the first time they walk into it for the showing, there's this kind of unmistakable low hum that pervades everything. And but of course, nowhere else, in reality, you'd walk out way. But in a good book or a movie, it doesn't really detract you. It's just one more thing. It's like a stain you can paint over. Oh, we'll figure out what that is. But once they're in, the house begins to, as the title says, take them into its grip, and reality starts to blend kind of with the menace of the house and the spaces around it. There's just nothing really wrong with this book. It's published by FSG Originals, which is this little imprint of FSG, a much larger, well-known publisher. But they also published Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy a few years ago, which was similarly perfectly weird and captivating. And I mentioned the first book then, called Annihilation, which was just turned into a movie that came out yesterday, that I saw Thursday, and then I'm going to go to again, actually, after this is over, because it's so unbelievably good. And it's just so well written, I think, and if it's possible, I've been doing this a long time, but it's possible, I've been falling more and more in love with the skill of writing in the last year or so. I don't know why, but whenever I come across someone that can really put phrases together in whatever style or genre, I really want to champion those books. And this is just a perfect case in point. And I know it may not be everybody's cup of tea, but it's not like it's not monsters and mayhem. It's just this kind of quiet little wonderful menace. I love it. I love it so much. And it's really hard to create a kind of a foreboding sense in books and maintain it, which is one of the reasons I like it, because in film it's pretty easy because our brains are engaged in a totally different way, and you're also seeing shadows and they're telling you where to look. And with a book, it's a very different skill, and it's just what she accomplished in creating this kind of slow boil is just fantastic. So even if it's not your normal thing, it's brief. If you're feeling daring someday, give it a try, because it's terrific. Okay, this is my last of the difficult topics for the day, because sometimes you come across books that I just think are too good to ignore. And they make me, if I find a book and it makes me pause for a second when I'm going through things. There's lots of books I look at that don't make the cut because they get great reviews, everybody loves them, and I start to read it and I'm like, no, I don't feel it, I don't know, or I know where it's going or whatever. This is a book by Australian author Corey Taylor, and it's called Dying, a Memoir. And it's a very honest and beautiful testament to the final weeks of her life. She led a really fascinating life as far as her writing career went. Again, she's from Australia, made her living as a freelance writer, children's author, but only after she was diagnosed with melanoma in 2005, when she was 50, did she decide to write her first novel. And she wrote a couple of novels in the next year, Me and Mr. Booker and My Beautiful Enemy, which were very popular. But then when the cancer kind of moved into her brain, unfortunately, and reached an untreatable stage, she decided to write this book. And I know this is the second one after Shepherds where it's, it's a writer writing about their own imminent death, and I'm not trying to, focus on depressing things today, but it's one of those topics that clearly, if written well, makes for a very powerful thing. And I think that's what the best books do, obviously, is take you to places and experiences that you have not had or will never have in some cases. And there are many books kind of written about death that are typically written by those who survived. I mean, Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking is obviously a clear favorite in that category, but there's something very different about reading the words of the person who is actually facing their own death. And most writers don't get the chance, or either just simply don't choose to write about this. And there's no expectation that they should. But again, I talk about books and movies and music all the time. I think of things, David Bowie's last album, Black Star, was created knowing he was dying. Warren Zevon, of all people, his last album, The Wind, which was very powerful, he knew he was dying. And they crafted these statements intentionally to represent that. There was a book, I just remembered this a couple years ago in one of my other talks, The Memory Chalet by Tony Judt. A similar thing. And it's just a straight up, honest, clear journey with a woman as she navigates her illness and recounts moments with her family and moves through her thoughts. And it's not like she goes through every moment of her life or even her illness. It's kind of a way for her to clear the way for acceptance of what's happening, and just this wonderful tying up of loose ends in a way. It's very moving. It's not super long, and I just think you really take something away from it. It's beautiful. Okay, 2 left. They're both fantastic. This is one of my personal favorites. So now we're at the end. So the objectivity chains are off. These are 2 of my favorites of the year. This got a truckload of exceptional reviews. This is The Wanderers by Meg Howry. It's her 3rd novel since leaving her former life as a ballet dancer. With the Joffrey Ballet, other companies too. She was real deal. She was the real deal. Her 2nd novel actually was called The Crane's Dance, which relates to ballet, which is wonderful too. But this is 2017's version. This fantastic story about 3 people under exceptional circumstances and the way the lives of their family are affected by those circumstances. It sounds a little sci-fi, but it's not. It's sci-fi maybe the way Station 11 was sci-fi, but so it's not really. It's about this aerospace company that's going to put the first humans on Mars, but to be sure that the people they're sending can handle this 17-month journey, what they decide to do is take the 3 candidates and place them into what they call the most realistic simulation ever created, meaning they're going to spend 17 months living and working exactly as they will be in space, but without ever leaving the Earth. So it follows everyone through the simulation. And again, while you're thinking it's sci-fi, it's not. The 3 people are astronauts, but these 3 people, grown adults, they're all, Helen, Yoshi, and Sergei, they all have children and spouses or ex-spouses. But the simulation means that they're simply cut off from everyone, and just as they would be in space. And that's where the title comes from, and the overarching theme of space. It's the space between people. It's the space between 3 people in this small capsule for 17 months, and the space between these 3 people and their families that are so far away. And the lines between real life and this 17-month simulation of real life. The astronauts are training to be the wanderers of the title, but Helen's daughter and Sergei's sons are themselves wandering through life, trying to navigate the spaces between. It's told in the 3rd person. Each chapter kind of focuses on one person's individual experiences. So, we'll learn a little bit about Helen here, and then about Yoshi, and then about Helen's daughter, and then it keeps rolling and starts to overlap, and the story becomes this larger, really beautiful thing. She's written a couple other books that are wonderful, and I'm going to start reading those too. But this one is just, it created such full characters and that idea, the idea between the space and the wandering, and I've never read a book quite like it. This is another one that I've been sharing with lots of different people, and they'll come back afterwards and go, where did that book come from? Like, I know, it was fantastic. Because people get it from me and they read an astronaut and they go, oh, it's space. I'm like, no, it's not. It's space between people, not just space. There always has to be a last book. And here it is. Has anyone read this, Ginny Moved?
No.
Okay. I'm so happy about that. This is one of those amazing novels that takes kind of a challenging subject and creates a very emotional and really believable character and set of circumstances. And it's definitely a tearjerker, which I love. This is Ginny Moved by, you know it, Ginny, I'm a huge crier. Ginny Moved by Benjamin Ludwig, and it's a story of Ginny, a teenager with autism who has bounced around the foster care system for a few years, but has finally landed in what she calls her, quote, forever home. The problem, however, is that even though this current family is what Ginny has always needed, she has this desperate longing for her baby doll that was left at her abusive mother's house when Ginny was taken away from it several years before. And her autism, issues with that, coupled with the arrival of her foster parents' newborn daughter, because as in every, that seems to be such a classic thing, they finally get a foster child and then after years they finally conceive of their own. Her autism and this new change keep her from being able to settle in, and a part of her still longs to go back for this baby doll, even though she knows that it was a bad situation. But the key to the story, and the reason it's so good, is that it's told in Ginny's voice, which is just remarkable. And one of the reasons that I think it feels so honest and true is that the author is himself a foster parent who adopted a teenage girl with autism. And through conversations with other parents and spending time at Special Olympic basketball practices, which his daughter and Ginny both take part in, he found the inspiration to write this story to both represent some truths about autism and about foster parenting. Ginny fixates on things, she repeats things over and over and over again throughout the book in her voice, but it never detracts from the voice, from the story in any way. It just pulls you into her character. And there have been lots of books that have kind of tried to be in the voice of someone with different issues or circumstances. And I feel like this is as true to the inner thoughts of a young girl with autism as an outsider is ever likely to get. And it's that element of truth that makes the story so emotional, because her foster parents make mistakes. And this is written by a man who's been in that position, so he's also, you can feel that he's kind of like, he knows from what he writes, and they're understandable mistakes, but the characters feel so real that you want to just reach into the pages and try to take care of this girl or comfort the parents. And it's the kind of book where I knew on page 2 that I was going to be kind of a mess before it was over, because I am a really big crier. I mean, everything from a story like this to the end of Rocky 2. I'm really easy. It's just who I am. And I actually debated for a minute putting the book on the list, because once I started to read it, I was upstairs at my desk and I read the first page and I just was like, I don't know if I can handle this. And I was on that like just about to cry zone the entire book until right where the end, it was just blew up in my bed. It was just awful. It was horrible. It wasn't horrible. It was great because I love that. But because I survived, I decided to add it to the list. It's beautiful, very memorable. A must read in my opinion. I just thought it was great because I love books that kind of break my heart a little. And this is a good one. I hope you found some books you've never heard of. Hope you found some books you've never read. As always, you can feel free to take any of these home with you today that you want to. And if you are so inclined, you can come back here in 12 months. Here we do this again. So thank you very much for coming.